Good afternoon. As we prepare for a field trip to the Cowpens Battlefield Park, I wanted to take some time to go into depth, just a little, about what we will soon discover as we go out into this National Battlefield Park. A lot of this information you'll be able to find on the National Park Service website, and you could also find a lot more information on the History Channel's website specifically about this battle. But let's take a look at what happened. Let's understand. The battle for Cowpens was a battle for the financial heart of the colonial empire. The colonial territory of South Carolina was the financial center of the colonies. More money flowed through this colony than any other colony during the 1700s. It was essential for the British Crown to control this area. To do so, the British Army divided its two main armies into two sections, the northern section and the southern section. The southern section was under the command of Cornwallis. That name will become familiar, and this is the beginning of his end at Cowpens. He further separates his two troops under one under his command and the other one under Lieutenant Colonel Talton. Talton is a name that struck fear into the colonial hearts. This was a man called No Quarter Talton, because at times when he would surround the troops of the Continental Army, he would give absolutely no quarter, and at times he had actually slaughtered the men that were trying to surrender to him. Cornwallis could be seen to give this man this kind of power because he was serious about taking over what he needed to take over, and no better than to give that job to a man who had no mercy. They needed to get the job done. Washington, in charge of all of the armies of the continent, sent one of his favorite generals, Nathan Greene, down to South Carolina to protect the colonies. While Greene was there, he further separated his armies as well and put one portion of his army under control of General Morgan. This battle is going to happen between Morgan and Talton, and it would decide the fate of Cornwallis in the near future. Morgan's troops could trade land for time. It was a quality that even Washington himself used quite effectively in the northern colonies. He would often have to fall back little bit by little bit and allow the British to come further and further inland, understanding that it's stretching their supply lines. Their connection to the sea was the only way in which they could keep their troops supplied. Stretching out these supply lines made it very difficult for them, and made it very easy for us then to go behind and create skirmishes and raids and cut off those supplies. The British knew this, and all the time it would place forward in their mind to always, and this was what happened to Cornwallis later, is that he would become overstretched in the colonies, especially in the South. At this time, Tarleton was chasing Morgan. The rains were coming down in a torrent in January. In January of 1781, the colonies were in a poor position. The ports of Savannah, Charleston, and Camden were all under control of the British. They were losing things left and right, and they needed a victory. Morgan was doing as best he could by continuing to fall back further and further into South Carolina. Some would think that maybe he wasn't had the wherewithal to stand up to the British. Others would say that he was just picking his time and place, and that time and place would come in the Cowpens. So we can see here in this representation, the Cowpens was an area of flat land that was bordered by the Broad River. All those rains that were coming down in January had swollen this river. It had swollen it so much that Morgan could not ford this river safely. he kind of had an area set up that he thought this is where he was going to make his stand. And he began to prepare his plan. Tarleton had to catch up to him as he was chasing them. Morgan had time to rest and prepare. So, when in January the 17th, Tarleton had to start his march at 4 o'clock in the morning just to get his troops up to where Morgan had prepared his ground. So they are already arriving in an exhausted state. They set up very hastily 2 lines of attack, where Morgan had set up 3 holding his cavalry in the rear, unseen and unknown that he still had any. He set up 3 lines. The first line, actually hidden throughout the woods, was his sharpshooters. The second line was his militia, and his third line was his Continental professional army. Now, it was often known that militia didn't always have all the training, and many times the British thought that they weren't very brave, that they could often be broken lines. So when they first come up to the field, they can't see the sharpshooters, they can only see the militia. Tarleton thought he had won the day. So the very first thing he's going to do, his troops, having marched all night long, were very exhausted, but his dragoons, the light infantry on horseback, usually carrying pistols, would be ready to go in and smash these militia. He thought he could turn it into a rout. They would be able to decimate these troops. So he sends them charging in from the flanks to go into the militia. Unbeknownst to him, that the first line of attack would catch him completely off guard. These snipers in the woods begin to pick off all of the officers and the dragoons, creating much havoc in them before they could even actually get up to the line. After they noticed they had done their first job, their next command under Morgan was to fall back and fall in line with the second line of militia. Morgan had asked his men. He knew his militia were always a little less trained, and he asked them, please give me 2 shots, just 2. Once they saw that the first line of skirmishers and snipers had fallen back into here, the dragoons began to regroup. They thought again that they could smash them, and they rode forward once again. But as they were doing that, they did get their 2 shots, which made them pause. And as they paused, in comes the cavalry from the right flank. This began to smash into the dragoons. Between those 2 shots and this smashing of the cavalry, utter and absolute damage was done to the dragoons now. They no longer could be an effective fighting force, and they began to retreat to the rear. This leaving now only the foot troops of the 7th Foot, the Legionnaires, and the light infantry to move forward. Supporting them from the rear was the 71st Highlanders, a group made of Scottish men dressed in kilts and bagpipes, blowing as loudly as they could and drawing their broadswords for close counterattack. As they moved in, not realizing that there was still another line, and that they saw that these guys were beginning to retreat, they thought the day was won. So they began to advance without any organization whatsoever. They thought now that they had a counterattack and that they could rue the day again with this rout. As they were running headlong into this, not realizing that the cavalry still here was organized, they came under direct fire. This direct fire was quite withering, but there was a mistake made. Over on the right side, the right flank of Morgan's troops, there was a commander named John Howard. He had given a command to his right flank to move forward. Somehow this had gotten confused, and instead they thought it was a retreat call. But because they are the professional army, they began to retreat in a very orderly fashion, not like the militia and running in all kinds of directions. They were still packed and compact, and in a fighting manner were going to retreat backwards behind these troops. Morgan running forward and asking Howard, what is going on? Why are you retreating? Howard says, I didn't give the order to retreat. In fact, it must have been a mistake. And so Morgan rushed past, met these gentlemen, and gave a direct order of about face. Now, because again, they had drilled and drilled and drilled into their heads, they immediately obeyed the order and did an about face. And this created a new situation, because at the same time, the cavalry had reorganized onto this side. And instead of following back into the rear, they now were able to do a double envelope, creating in and taking out the complete left flank of the British. And as both of these two flanks created a double envelope and completely surrounding these, an en masse surrender began to happen. All of this took place in 1 hour. It was something Tarleton and his troops were totally unprepared for. Every single one of these troops were professional troops. They were going against half these troops who were militia. They had very little training and had very little respect for what they could do. And yet, they had enticed them to come forward and be completely surrounded. And it had actually blown their minds. When we look at the numbers, the troop numbers, the Americans had 1,000 troops, not all of them professional troops. The British and Loyalists had 1,100, outnumbering them. The casualties, though, would show a different story altogether. Some put the casualties for the British at 39 officers, 60 soldiers killed. Others said it was more like 110 had died, with 200 wounded. Some had said that it was between 500 and 829 that were captured. The Americans, though, lost only 12 killed and 60 wounded. Tarleton himself would continue to try to battle and left the field under a continual a battle all the way back across the Parlock River. They couldn't capture him, and he went all the way back to Charleston to Cornwallis with the news of what had happened and the great defeat that would carry this day. Morgan would continue to move to the north and to the east to connect with Nathanael Greene, with all of his prisoners, who would later be taken all the way up into Virginia. This began the end for Cornwallis. It was a turning point. It was a rallying point for the troops of the South. And this would lead to Cornwallis's Yorktown, or to the very end of the Revolutionary War. This was an incredibly important battle. It happened where we're going to go see in South Carolina. I wanted you to be prepared for it and understand that it's a moment, one battle, that changed the entire war. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you will be able to see these things now as we go out into the field and we're able to actually look at where these troops had to battle, and we can imagine exactly from their viewpoint what's going on and how they had this river to the back and they knew that they couldn't cross it. Some say that this was the part that gave them the courage. We'll see that. We'll see if it was this or if it was finally Morgan just picked the right place at the right time. That'll be a question that you'll be able to answer as you walk the field yourself and put yourself in both the shoes of the Continental Army and the shoes of the Redcoats. Thanks, and I can't wait till we get there.